Good morning, Baktash. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, well, we're honored to have you. We're going to give people one more minute to sign in. It's early there, in California?
It is. It's 8:15, but it's my favorite part of the day.
Okay, well, that's generous of you. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, friends, welcome to this morning's adult forum. It's 11:15, and I know we're going to have a lot of conversation, a great conversation with Baktash Ahadi. So let's get started. And I am really, really honored, Baktash, that you could join us today. And I'll just tell our group a little bit about you. Afghan immigrant, now American citizen, leadership consultant, former Peace Corps volunteer, and combat interpreter. Baktash Ahadi is the founder and the principal consultant of Talim, which is a leadership consultancy focused on education and leadership development. Now, in that capacity, he led the State Department's Afghan familiarization course, and he literally trained all the diplomats who were sent to Afghanistan between 2016 and 2020. I'm sure that was a great experience, Baktash. You can tell us something about that. Sure. But also, it's especially because of your background in Afghanistan in so many different ways that we're happy to welcome you today, because we got the very good news that our church is now sponsoring, with another church in our neighborhood, a family of 6 who just arrived recently in the past 3 or 4 weeks from Afghanistan. And there's so much I know we can learn from you. Baktash himself immigrated in 1986 at the age of 5 to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where 9 families from St. Paul's Lutheran Church sponsored him and helped his family resettle. And your parents are still there, right, Baktash?
That's correct.
And then he attended Susquehanna University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, studying strategic studies. But he took time off to get some real life experience in strategic issues, going to Afghanistan between 2010 and 2013 to serve as a combat interpreter with the Marine Special Operations Command. And Baktash has a number of firsts in his life. I mean, his was the first Afghan family to settle in Carlisle. He's the first of generation in his family to go to college. He was the first Peace Corps volunteer from Afghanistan and served in Mozambique. In fact, I would say that Baktash's American story really started with the Peace Corps, way back when he was maybe not even born, or at least a small child. And I think, Baktash, maybe we could start there today. I'll just say welcome again, and maybe you could tell us your story of coming to America, the motivation, the adventure of getting here, and how it felt when you landed as the first Afghan family in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Sure. Gosh, Anne, that was a wonderful introduction. I'm humbled, to say the least. Thank you for that. Basically boiled down my life story into a couple minutes, which is wonderful. Sure, I'd be delighted to tell you the story. And what I'd love to do is, well, let's start with my father, because I love my father very much, and he's a guiding force in my life. And what's interesting about my father is that he fell in love with the idea of America before coming to America. And so he was taught by a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1960s in Kandahar, who he remembers his name to be Eric. And through that experience, my father fell in love with the values and the ideals of what America stood for, based on his interaction with this Peace Corps volunteer. And that eventually led my father to move to Kabul and get a job with USAID as their first key punch operator on their demographic study to better understand the population of Afghanistan. And what's interesting about that story is that it was that experience that eventually helped my family come to the United States. Specifically, when the Soviets invaded in 1979, my father essentially his life was put in danger. And he had to essentially make a decision to leave the country. And at that time I was 3 years old. And I had a younger brother at the time named Ilya, and he was just over a year old. And obviously I don't remember any of this, because memory as a child starts around the age of 3. So I don't remember any of this. But nonetheless, my father was given an ultimatum that he was either going to join the Soviet forces or else his life would be put in danger. And so he came home that day, told my mother, when you go to work and you come back to feed Ilya, breastfeed him during your lunch break, don't go back to work. We're going to leave. And make sure not to tell anybody. And so lo and behold, my mother came home from her lunch break to feed my younger brother. And When she was done, my father was outside with a taxi, and they essentially made their journey. And so they essentially went outside of Kabul, connected with the Mujahideen, spent the next 7 days and 6 nights trekking over the Hindu Kush mountain range, sleeping during the day mostly, and then traversing and trekking through the night. I just love that story about my parents because as an adult, I asked my father, I asked him the question, would you have done that if you knew what you were going to get into, essentially? And his response was candid and honest, and he said, definitely not. And the reason for that's because in the border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan was heavily guarded by Soviets and Soviet gunships, in particular helicopters and jets. And so my family was shot, again, I don't recall. But what's interesting about our family stories is that even though we don't live them, we're told them. And then once we're told them, we tell them as though they're our own experiences. It's
right.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how that happens, isn't it? So I'm speaking from the place of being an infant and a child and not knowing, not living this experience and actually not remembering it. But nonetheless, we almost died twice. My parents tell the story quite vivid, just like a movie, whereby we're going through the valleys of the Hindu Kush and being spotted by these Soviet gunships and being quite literally shot down. There was a moment where where this was happening, and my parents essentially were like, there was no way out. They knew this jet was coming through to essentially unleash its bullets onto us. And we're in the midst of a village, actually. And so what ended up happening was all the villagers, they essentially, according to my parents, fled. And my father had the wherewithal to say, we are not going to run separately in different directions. We're going to come together. And if we die, we'll die together. And so my father essentially screamed to my mom, might meet up with us or his children. And then my father also had his sister there with her family. And so there were 10 of us together, huddled together, when this gunship, the Soviet gunship, came over top of us and shot on both sides, just like you'd see in a World War II movie or an Indiana Jones film or whatever the case may be. And so miraculously, my parents and my family were unscathed. The Soviet gunship ended up leaving, who knows why. A few villagers actually died in that attack. And what's interesting about it is that we, and I asked my parents about this, like, what is it that they think happened that day? And they will bring in, notions of God protecting us and God being there for us. How else could we survive this attack? And it happened twice. But nonetheless, my parents, we ended up getting to Peshawar, spending a few months there, and then moving eventually to Islamabad. And in Islamabad, my parents were trying to figure out what to do with their lives. The war in Afghanistan was raging at that point with the Soviets. And my father took a chance, and he went to the consular office in Islamabad and essentially presented his case, saying that he had worked with USAID. And what's interesting at the time is that the consular officer at the time knew the director of USAID, who my father worked under. And he essentially validated my father's story, and one thing led to another. We fit the profile of what St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Carlisle, Pennsylvania wanted in terms of a sponsoring family. So soon after, my family and I were on a plane to the United States. And this was in 1986, and we arrived in January, where it was really cold. And as I'm writing my memoir now about my parents' arrival to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, our sponsors tell us what we were wearing, how we were not prepared for winter. We were in sandals, right? We had been up all night, all day. And it's just really interesting because I remember my first memory of coming to America was coming off of this plane, going down the steps and coming onto a tarmac and seeing these families welcoming us with signs that say the Ahadis. Although I couldn't read, I remember signs, and them clapping in the middle of the night for us. And they presented my brother and I with toy trucks. He got the red one, and I got the blue one. And so obviously we fought over this truck. And what's really interesting about this experience is, as I talked to my parents about this, we had no idea where we were going. We had no idea what central Pennsylvania held for us. it's really important to kind of note that in the context of the 1980s, what people understood about the world is mostly what they saw on television or movies. And
Right.
so my parents just assumed, Anne, and this may be something that your congregation may want to speak about one day, is our impressions of the world is based on what we see on a screen. And how does that impact us, and how does that essentially stay with us? And so in the context of my family's lived experiences, my parents, when they thought about America, they thought that every place looked like New York City. Flashing lights, big buildings,
Right.
place of ambition and opportunity. And what's really curious about my parents, in particular my father's story, because that's how I started this, was we ended up going to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. For those on this call that may know Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or Central Pennsylvania, it's heavily a lifestyle of farming, especially in the 1980s. And so as we're kind of, embracing this new home of ours in the 1980s, my father, in some sense, noticed that, there were a whole bunch of Amish around. And what he thought was really curious, like in the midst of all these cornfields, there were the Amish. And he thought to himself, God is playing a sick joke on me. He takes me out of Kandahar, where everybody dresses in black and has big beards, and he takes me to a new land known as Pennsylvania, where everybody who has big beards and dresses in black. So I find it to be really interesting, and the world can be really interesting in that way if you see it through that lens. But nonetheless, let me tell you about these families, these 9 families that were welcoming to us and pretty much adopted us in terms of helping us assimilate to American culture. So each family was responsible for a different thing. So one family, for example, would be responsible for helping my parents learn how to shop in a grocery store, right? And one family would be responsible for helping my father and my mother learn how to drive.
Mm-hmm.
And another family would be responsible for helping, for example, my mother learn how to use female products, right?
Mm-hmm.
All relatively new things. And so in the context of our lived experience, we had these families to kind of help us and teach us basically understand this new way of life. And I attest our wonderful upbringing in some sense to St. Paul's Lutheran Church, because they were just, although there were some interesting kind of moments of misunderstanding, they embraced us from a place of real love and a real sense of curiosity. And I think that was a wonderful way for us to kind of understand what America was about. People that didn't know us, people that didn't come from our same background, were welcoming us with a sense of grace, openness, and curiosity. And that's what led my parents to essentially, my family, to stay there. And that's what led my parents to stay there until this day, right? So they still live in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so it was a really wonderful experience. And a lot, so I still go home to go see, John Miller, Emily Thama, the Maraviches, all these families that essentially, helped my brother and I and my parents understand the values and the ideas of what America is all about. So yeah, was that helpful?
That's a wonderful story, Baktash, and it illustrates something that we often think about here in our refugee ministry, and that is that, a lot of organizations could buy you a car, get you a house, give you a check. But what faith communities can do with newly arriving refugees is what you just described, that human connection, that warm embrace, that personal welcome. You really can't beat that in terms of helping people resettle. And you just illustrated that so beautifully. I know that experience helped shape what you then went on to do in your life. And I do want to talk more about that, but I wondered if you wanted to offer us just 1 or 2 suggestions or tips, since we're receiving this new family starting really now. What 1 or 2 things would you like to recommend to us? I remember you talked to me about radical curiosity. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Sure. I think that's wonderful. What's interesting about our lived experience as human beings is that as I'm learning, as I'm kind of embracing what it means to be, how do I say this? What it means to be a mature, functioning adult. I'm learning that nobody really has it figured out. And we're all kind of just putting we're all just kind of trying to all figure it out collectively. Okay. This is something that I've become very keenly aware of as I become very inquisitive about the world in a very deep sense, man. And so what's interesting about this is that, the families that essentially embraced us and sponsored us were deeply curious about who we were. Tell us about your lives. Tell us about how you came here. Tell us about how you do things. And I found that to be the most positive way to kind of engage our family. And as a result, my parents would reciprocate that sense of curiosity, like help us understand what the Holy Trinity is. Help us understand how Jesus can be God on earth, right? Help us understand at 18 why you tell your kids to leave. Why does that happen? Help us understand how you can allow your daughters and your sons to have boyfriends and girlfriends. Why does that happen? Like, don't you believe in marriage? Or if you do believe in marriage, why do they date beforehand? Right? Like just fundamental assumptions about how we operate in the world. Why is it sometimes that other men can kiss my wife? My father would ask, why is this allowed? Like, why does this happen in America? Right? It comes from a place of it doesn't come from a place of judgment. It comes from a place of, this is a different operating system, right? So as we kind of think about what culture is this thing that's ubiquitous, yet it's invisible. So our job is to say, how do we make sense of this thing, right? How do we make sense of this thing that's ubiquitous yet invisible? And so that's what I would offer your congregations to say, as you embrace this family, to say they're quite literally, they've been shaped and formed in a different operating system. Now the onus is on us to say, let's figure out what that's all about, right? Let's figure out what these values are. Let's figure out what these principles are. Let's figure out what these social norms are, because in some sense, I don't mean to get too metaphysical and philosophical, but I think it's important to think about this way. I work in the space of language and communication. And so what's interesting about that is I will ask a question, for example, of you, maybe Anne, or anybody that'd like to kind of respond, is to say, what is the purpose of language? Have you all thought about that? Like, what would you say the purpose of language is, right? And if you ask this question, I ask this question at the State Department a lot, working with diplomats. And often people will say, language is to help us communicate. It's to help us essentially share our thoughts and our ideas and our opinions, and basically help us work together. And all of that is true. All of that is true. But I would offer another suggestion as well in terms of what the purpose of language is. I think in some sense, and other linguists in some sense also believe this, is that language is quite literally, we've been gifted with this technology of language through natural means or divine means. But nonetheless, we have it. Other creatures in the ecosystem of the world don't necessarily have the same capabilities that we do. So what is this technology all about? And I would offer that language is actually a way for us to kind of understand our thoughts. And the reason I say that's because, can you have an idea or a feeling without being able to put language around it? Can you think something without being able to say it in your mind? And I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm not sure.
Well, the language, yeah,
please.
Yeah, no, that's right. It shapes your thinking, right? Also, and when we talked about this before, you mentioned the difference in American and Afghan thinking about time, for example, past and future. Maybe we could share that, and then you could tell us a little bit about your combat interpreter experience and your reflections from that, and then we'll go to questions. I know people will have a lot.
Oh my gosh, of course. And so just to kind of cap this off is so in some sense, language is there for essentially us to think. And so if people are thinking in a different language, that actually takes shape in the way we express it through our behavior, right? So for example, you'll find people that may speak multiple languages, and Anne, you may be one person in English, but you may be a completely different person in French, right?
Very true. Very
true. And so we have to we have to say, how does that happen? And I'm saying it's happening because we actually think differently in a different language, okay? So So I would offer that in terms of, as you engage this Afghan family, think about, okay, what's the language they use for this thing? How do they understand it? And that's one notion of radical curiosity. It's like, how do they even think about this? So you brought up this wonderful thing about time and our notion and our relationship with time as it pertains to our sense of identity. So what's wonderful about America is everything about America is forward thinking. Everything in this country, to include the way we engage with each other, in some sense, is aspirational. It's always about, what are you doing next? So this is an example that may resonate with some folks on the line, because I see some friendly faces, is when you come back from a trip or having lived somewhere abroad, the first thing that people in America will say was, how was it? And they may give you 22 seconds of their time to answer. How was Mozambique, and how was Europe, right? They may give you 22 seconds. And then afterwards, they'll say, great, what's next? What are you going to do next? What's after this? Oh, you just finished medical school? Congratulations. How was it? Difficult, great. Where are you going to do your residency? Great, you did your residency, where are you going to practice? Great. Oh, you just got married? Great. You're going to have kids, you're going to move, what are you going to do next? So it's this, just in our language, you're always actually stepping ahead to say, what's the next thing that's happening? Or here's another real concrete example. It's like, once our children and the next generation finishes college, the first thing that we tell them is to get a job. Go get a job. The second thing we tell them to do is get a financial advisor. And the reason why we tell them to get a financial advisor is so they can plan for retirement. If you put away, 10%, even when the market crashes, you'll still get 8% return. And after 40 years, you'll have about $2.3 million in the bank.
So all forward looking. And is that not similar in Afghanistan?
Right. So in the context of Afghanistan, this is not something that is part of, en masse, and part of the social fabric of how Afghans engage each other. In the context of Afghanistan, it's very much the opposite. So instead of saying, Anne, who are you and what will you be and who do you plan on being? It's to say, ma'am, who are you? In fact, who's your father? Who's your grandfather? Who was he and why should I know you? Right? So it's the sense of identity that's based in where you came from. So you'll have many people in the context of Afghanistan expressing who they are based on who their forefathers were.
Nice.
Right? Who their forefathers were. And so what's interesting is we in the context of the United States, when we're going off to, let's say, engage Afghans, is we'll say, great, and what are we going to do next week? What are we going to do next year? This is the project that we're going to do. And Afghans are just like, wait a second, we haven't gotten there yet. Actually, we don't really know how to process that right now. Let's talk about who you are, Anne, in terms of where you came from. So just a simple engagement in terms of how we understand time and identity doesn't allow us to actually connect fully.
Right. So true. And
Right.
then language enters into it too, shaping thinking in different ways. So I know that this, because you wrote that op-ed in the Washington Post recently, where you commented on the issue of cultural competency and how that plays into things like our engagement with Afghanistan as a country over years and the recent developments. And I thought maybe you could share some thoughts from that experience when you were working with the Marine Special Operations Command.
Yeah,
and, the cultural competence aspect.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you for offering. And so what I noticed about the conversation as it pertains to Afghanistan, and is that as people kind of dissecting what went wrong there, the thing that I found to be a major gap in our analysis of what's going on in the narrative of Afghanistan is that we, in the context of the United States, at least in this war, and I would argue many others that I've studied, is to say we never actually met people where they are. Meaning we come in with the sense of hubris and the sense of American exceptionalism and say, this is how we do it. It's working great for us. You should do it too. In fact, we want you to do it. We will give you funding to do it the way we do it. And so we try to provide this incentive of financial incentives to say, we have this, it works wonders for us. You should try it too, without having a conversation to say, where can we meet you in the middle? Where are you and how can we meet you where you are? Whether it's here, it doesn't really matter. But what's important is the conversation to say, where are you, Anne, and how can I be of service to you? And how can we do this together in collaboration to make Afghanistan no longer a safe haven for terrorists, to make Afghanistan a place where it can defend itself against, foreign invaders and foreign terrorists, so to speak. And so I found that to be the missing thing when I was working with the Marines in Afghanistan, is as my job as an interpreter, right, going off with them on missions with the Afghan commandos, basically being the bridge between these two entities. My job in many ways was not just to transmit one message to another person, right?
Mm-hmm.
My job was essentially, I found my job to be this place of trying to help each other help both parties understand each other, right? So they'll ask me, Baktash, why do Afghans wash their feet? Well, why are these commandos not eating right now? We're going into combat. Why aren't they eating? Well, it's Ramadan, they're fasting. Oh, interesting. And so there'd be the Afghans too would ask me, why do these Marines have all these tattoos all over their bodies? Why are they defacing what God has created, their body? And so I found myself in this place where I was always kind of like just helping each other understand and doing it from a place of like, oh gosh, this is going to be an offensive question. How do I navigate this conversation, right? And so I found this to be when there wasn't conflict with the Taliban, so to speak, we were fighting against a common enemy. I found that the Marines and the Afghan commandos were at odds with one another because they didn't understand the reasons why they did what they did, right? Why do these Afghan commandos have to kiss me when they greet me? What is up with all these hugging? Like, why do we always have to embrace each other? The Marines would ask. Why can't we just go into an office and talk shop right away? Why do we have to ask them about their families? Like, this is deeply personal stuff. Why do these people keep asking me how much money I made? What is going on here? And so there was a major disconnect. And so that's a lot of what I saw. And I found myself saying, well, these are just micro examples of what plays out over and over and over and over again. And eventually you realize, like, if a person doesn't see eye to eye with me, how can I actually trust them? How can I actually trust somebody that doesn't see, acknowledge, and embrace who I actually am? Right. And again, we're working in the business of people. So if we're not trying to understand people, like the United States went to Afghanistan in some sense to win the hearts and minds of Afghans. How do you win the hearts and minds of the people if you're not radically curious about them and you don't meet them then? Like, how is this something that we haven't learned yet, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, from the likes of it for as long as I've been alive? What is this about? What does this say about who we are as Americans, and how we kind of engage people in their own land? And so I found this to be really, really important to kind of talk about. And I think it's something that we can easily do just by being radically curious.
Something we need to think about going forward, for sure. You served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mozambique. I'm interested in hearing more about your motivations in signing up for that, and whether you had some of the same experience that you're describing we had in Afghanistan, the cultural difference, and how you fit in there.
Yeah, oh gosh, I tell people, thank you for asking. I tell people that the Peace Corps, serving in the Peace Corps is the best education of my life, right? The best education of my life, because it taught me that I can, I got to serve in Mozambique in a small rural village by the name of Moatiz. And so I was assigned as an English teacher there. And the reason I went is because in 2005, when I graduated college, the United States was fully embraced in the war in Iraq. And I was interested in serving the United States, but I didn't want to serve in that war. It just felt wrong to me. But I loved America, and I still do for everything that this country has given my family. America is a wonderful place if you believe it to be magical, and we can get into that in a bit.
Right.
But I wanted to serve in the Peace Corps because of how much the Peace Corps influenced my father, and how he fell in love with the ideals of America before. I mean, being in Kandahar, which is notorious now for being the home to the Taliban, and so I knew the impact that the Peace Corps had on my father, and how much it made him realize that this place can be wonderful. We can have impacts on people in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Like, we are a node in a network. That's more true now than ever before. And so I learned that lesson, and I wanted to serve in that way, to say, I want to serve. I want to serve a people that I don't know, but do it from a place of, again, radical curiosity. What are these people about? And I have to just kind of also lay this out there too. Is I started college at Susquehanna University, and 1 week after I started college, 9/11 happened. And the question that my life followed from that point was, why do people do what they do, and how does the environment shape and form them? And so in that stage of my life, I was very interested in seeing how landscapes, environments, cultures influence and or impact people and how they live their lives. So I was deeply interested in seeing a lot of the world. So I spent 7 years of my 20s abroad trying to understand how environments shape us. And Mozambique taught me, oh gosh, it taught me so many things. But mostly, I think the magical thing about the Peace Corps that may resonate with some folks on the line is, I went into Mozambique trying to change my community. And what's wonderful about that experience is that when I left that community in Mozambique, I realized that they changed me more than I could possibly change them. They had more of an impact on my worldview and how much I didn't know, how good I could be, how much more potential I had to be of service to others. And I think that's the magic of the Peace Corps, and those types of experiences, when you go into a place thinking, I'm going to provide something that these people don't know. I am going to essentially help them. What ends up happening is the opposite happens. My worldview, my perspective, my sense of understanding of how lucky I was in the world and how a lot of things aren't in my control was taught to me there. And this idea of being adaptive, this idea of being curious, the idea of, I have to tell you, one of the proudest moments in my life was I was awarded to be the most assimilated volunteer in Mozambique.
Wow.
And yeah, I loved it because I just threw myself at everything I didn't understand. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I was raised in Pennsylvania as an immigrant kid, trying to fit in, trying to mirror other people, trying to mimic other people. And that just stayed with me. And it allowed me to kind of really embrace Mozambican culture.
Wow, that was an important lesson for life, for sure. Baktash, you mentioned that you're thinking of taking leave right now from your job in order to do some work around this question of cultural competence. Maybe you could comment a little bit on that, and then we can go to questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, I am taking leave. I took a fancy job, and I realized that I took it right when Afghanistan fell, Kabul fell. And now that that's the case, something like 117,000 Afghan refugees are going to be coming to the United States within the next 6 months. 65,000 are already here, 2 of which are my cousins and their families, which I was able to help pull out during the collapse of the country. So yeah, there's so much work to do, and a couple friends of mine are leading this effort. There are a lot of people in my network that are leading this effort about resettlement and helping Afghans feel like they have a sense of home and belonging. So I'm very much interested in that conversation and working with individuals, whether they're churches, whether they're community centers, whether they're places of worship, whatever they may be, because these refugees aren't going to New York City and San Francisco, where there's already a whole bunch of diversity, a whole bunch of, I guess, just economic opportunity. They're going to places like, small towns in Minnesota or Wisconsin or Kansas or Texas, right? And so they're going to places where, very much like how my family went to, where there's really nothing that they imagine to be, right? Like when you think about America, you don't think about cornfields in the Amish, and so I just remember my family's lived experience and how much there were all the things that we received, which was wonderful, to include an embrace, curiosity, engagement, but then also too, there were also a whole bunch of things that my parents and my family wasn't able to get that I think would be very useful in terms of helping people understand that America is a wonderful place. It does have its deficiencies. I mean, the departure from Afghanistan is a deep shame, I think, on America's legacy in that country. And so what we have to do now is to say, great, how can we show new Americans or people that are going to become Americans what this place is all about. And so I'm very much interested in that conversation.
That's really great. And I hope that as you develop your thinking and your activities in that area, you can be a resource for us, and that this is just the beginning of a conversation with you. I'm sure many people here would love to engage more with you on that. And with that, I'd like to then turn to our audience for some questions. And you should know, Baktash, that we have a Zoom audience with us today. And we also have people sitting in our nave who may want to ask a question. So I'm going to let me put everybody up here. Jana, is Jana Story there with the mic? Jana, would you like to start and see if there's someone in the nave who would like to ask the first question of Baktash? And anyone on Zoom who would like to ask, can you put your hand up, either your little icon or just keep your hand up in the air, and I'll do my best to monitor the screen and call on you one by one. But we'll start with Jana. I can't hear the question. No sound. Now? Sorry, can't hear. Maybe we'll go to the Zoom while you fix that, okay? Someone on Zoom like to ask a question? I'm looking.
Yes.
Question?
I think people are trying to figure out how to unmute.
Ah, yes, you have to be the name. We're all muted. Let me call Siri.
Baktash, if you can hear me, I was curious if you still had relatives living in Kabul.
Oh, is this Jesse Hyman?
Yes, it is.
Oh gosh, how are you, Jesse? It's so good to hear from you.
It's great to see you, Baktash.
God bless you. I want to tell everybody who Jesse is really quickly. So Jesse Hyman, who just asked me this question, taught my father English in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
And so what's wonderful about Jesse is that she has a son named Oliver who I grew up with, and we would get, I remember Jesse, I thought about you recently because I'm writing about my lived experience, my childhood. I remember I came over one day with my father, and you were living on, I think, Parker Street or close by where that white picket fence. And
yes.
Yep. And we came into your home, and Oliver had the best toys. He had the best toys, and I didn't have anything. I had like corduroys and 1980s clothes that my parents gave to me that dressed me. And I didn't like any of the stuff that my parents gave me to dress in. So I remember Oliver having the best clothes, and I remember the best clothes and the best toys. And I remember asking to play with his toys, and he got so upset. He got so upset, and he cried about it. And then you and my dad were like trying to figure out, what do we do with these two boys? So I just want to say I remember that about your home and Oliver, and we miss you very much. Yep.
Well, if you wouldn't mind me also sharing my first memory of you, Baktash.
Sure. Let's see how embarrassing this is.
I was driving you and Oliver to maybe one of your first days at preschool. And there was we were at the intersection of High and Hanover, and there was some very loud, sharp noise. And you were both sitting in the back, and you jumped down and covered your head. And we're clearly scared by the noise. And I have always had in my head that it was a reflection of some experience that you had when you were escaping from Kabul. And I don't know if that's something that I have just chose to believe over the years, or do you have any possible explanation, recollection?
Oh gosh, Jesse, thank you for sharing that. I don't remember that story, but my sense is I remember my parents, now that we're kind of talking about our escape, is that we definitely suffer from PTSD. And as a child, I remember, like my parents would always tell me, like when you hear a loud bang, hide behind a tree, hide behind wherever you can possibly hide. So we were relatively new when you met us, Jesse, and so I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure that's what happened. Yep. So, so for those listening, their family that's coming into your congregation may experience something like that. So just be cognizant that they may have dealt with that sort of trauma. And to your question, Jesse, do I still have family there? The answer is yes. Half of my family on my parents from both sides still live there. So we're trying to figure out how to get them out because on both sides, my family is Shia. And so under the Taliban regime in the 1990s, they were very much interested in not only persecuting Shias, but also committing a sense of genocide against them. And so if we know anything about the Taliban, they are telling us who they are. They're staying constant with their messages from the 90s. So my family is deeply scared to kind of, in some sense, go outside. They're not sure what to do. So my father and my mother are working to kind of get them out right now. So yes, Jesse, I still have family there. Yep.
Thank you, Jesse. Carol Bartholomew, you have your hand up?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yes. Well, thank you so much. I just have a very practical question about how we might relate to our new family that's coming. I'm just curious, what are some mistakes, some kind of classic mistakes that very well-meaning, well-intentioned people might make? What are some pitfalls we might look out for?
Great.
How about the lasagna story for one?
Yeah, sure. I love that. Yeah, well, you're so great. You're so wonderful. Sure, Carol, that's a great question. And so what Anne's referring to is what's interesting about the 1980s is if anybody remembers, there wasn't a thing called Google back then, or a thing called the internet that people were using. And so what was interesting is that the St. Paul's Lutheran Church that took us in, they didn't know they didn't know what to make for us as a matter of food for dinners. So they'd invite us to their homes, and my father, and I remember this, is we would go to our sponsors' homes, and every sponsor's home that we went to, whether it's George, Emily, Margie, Charlene, whoever, they would all make us lasagna. They all made us lasagna, the food lasagna. And what's really curious about that is we had a very strong distaste to the lasagna because we didn't like cheese. Like it just wasn't something that mapped to our palate, right? Especially the American, like mozzarella, cheddar, these types of cheese that are very strong, right? So those that on the line that have been to Afghanistan, cheese exists in Afghanistan, but it's very bland. In fact, it tastes somewhat like tofu. It just doesn't have that much flavor, right? So what's interesting is we weren't able to eat this food. I remember my mother, like now that I'm talking to my mom about this, she would tell my father to say, just tell George that I have female problems, that I can't eat this food. I'm not hungry. And I wouldn't eat. I would like get under the table, and my dad would like take the food and push it around the plate. And they would ask them, "Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Ahadi, did you really enjoy the food?" And my dad would, be polite and lie right to their face. "Yes, we really enjoy this food. This is really great." And later on, my father asked George Marovich, one of our sponsors, when my father was comfortable with him, he said, "George, I really want to ask you a question. When you were making us for dinner and when you invited us to your home, you, Margie, Emily, Charlene, you guys all made us lasagna. Why did that happen?" And George said, well, he was really honest with us. And he said, well, you guys look Italian. So we made you something that, comes from Italy because we thought you'd eat it. So you guys are brown, you guys have dark hair. So we made you lasagna because we thought that you would really like it. We were like, are you serious? So the reason why this is So the reason why this is important is because food is such an important thing for a person to realize that that's the thing they miss most outside of family when they're trying to find a sense of home and belonging. So Carol, thank you for your wonderful question. Food is huge. Ask your families, like, what is it that they love, right? Eggplant, rice, What if they eat halal? That'd be a really great question to ask, actually. Also, too, like most likely they're not going to eat pork, so anything that has mixed or touched that would be a big no-no. But I would say, Carol, just a big thing to be cognizant of is food, and then also male-female dynamics in terms of how men and women touch. So I think men should be very cognizant of how they touch, let's say, the wife in the family, or how close they get to her. So I would just be really cognizant of those male-female dynamics, because it's, again, people are shaped and formed in a certain way, and so they may be uncomfortable, but they may be too polite to say something, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Baktash. We have a question in the chat here.
Okay.
The question is, how quickly do you see the newly arriving Afghanis becoming a part of the fabric of America? As a people.
What a lovely question. What a lovely
John
question.
Angst, I believe that is, yeah.
So John asked that question. So John, I think it depends. It depends on a family. It depends on how progressive they are. It depends on the community that's welcoming them. It depends on their economic means. If both the wife and the husband have to work. It depends on how assimilated their children become. It depends on all of these things. But I think that the thing that I would think about is everybody's going to process differently, and everybody's going to think about the world differently. And so you may have, let's say, the wife become completely assimilated, and the husband saying, no, this isn't going to work. And this may even create conflict amongst them. So I think the answer is that it depends. I think if I were you, I would think about, I would think of them as going through a process. Like also too, they're in a place of grieving, right? Grieving for a country that they've had to essentially leave. And so everybody here on the line, I'm sure, has lost somebody close. And so this may resonate with you, is that everybody grieves in a different way. And we have to let people grieve in their own personal way. And that may take a lot longer with some folks. That may never leave some folks. My mother, she grieved the loss of her homeland for nearly 22 years, right? And my father moved on right away. He was like, thank God I'm an American. My mother was just like, no, because of you, I left my family. I'm not happy here, right? She felt deeply alone for the longest time. So my mother, it took her just a lot longer. And obviously now she's thriving and she loves where she is. But I think the question just depends on the individual, right? It depends on how somebody processes this new world, but then also the world in which they're coming from, they no longer can touch, taste, and feel. And I think that's something that we have to be really sensitive to. Yeah.
Baktash, is there one thing about American culture that is particularly difficult for Afghans to adjust to? Something that we should be particularly attentive to beyond the two things you mentioned?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much. I think the thing that's surfacing now, though, Anne, is, what's interesting about the Afghan sensibility is that it's deeply collectivist in nature, right? It's deeply collectivist in nature. So, the life goal in America in many ways is to become successful, and we can all define that based on our lived experience. How do you define success? But in the context of Afghanistan, family is the utmost notion of what success is. Like to have a family of your own, to be able to provide for your family, to be of service to your family. So what's really difficult about that is, as these parents have these children who essentially want to become as Americanized as possible, that's something that's really curious about America too, is in my family, like my brothers and I, other Afghan Americans that I know, when they came to this country, they wanted to become very American very fast. So there was a major divide between parents and their children. And so the one thing that I would think about if I were you is to say, how is coming to America going to affect the dynamics of this family? And how is that going to play out? Right? Because the children are going to say, great, now we have all this, we're in a place of abundance.
No, they're not.
But the parents are going to come from a place of, all this sounds great, all this looks great, but it doesn't necessarily map to who I am right now. And it may never map to who they are. So you'll find this divide. And so if I was part of your organization, I would say, I would have those conversations of like, how are your kids doing? How are you doing? And how is your relationship with your children doing? Right? Because you will find that they will, in some sense, divide. And in the context of America, we love that like our children become as self-sufficient as soon as possible to go off and conquer the world. That is something that we love as Americans. But in the context of my family, is my parents wanted that too, but my parents didn't want us to go away. Now I have a brother that's, with my parents, thank God. But my other brother and I, we live far away. And so my parents have been here for 30 years, 30 plus years, and they still suffer from feeling lonely, right? We've raised our children and they've left us. We understand this is America, but they've left us. And so my parents feel that. And that may actually resonate with some of you too. Like, why am I alone all the time? Especially during this time of COVID. And so I would just be really sensitive to this idea of what a collectiveness is and how family is deeply important to that sensibility.
Thank you, Baktash. I think Leon and Mary Goodson have a question.
Yes, as you know, everybody knows our family that will be moving into the house on Thursday. There are no small children. They're all adult size. The sons range from age 16 or 19 through 30.
16, right.
16 through 30. And that means that the household consists of one female and 5 males, 5 adult males. Many of our volunteers are female. Can you offer some advice on how to make interactions as smooth as possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for those details. Yeah, I would say I don't think there's a problem for again, it depends. You're gonna have to kind of gauge that when you embrace your family. You're gonna have to kind of use your own lived experience to make an assessment. But my sense is just is that it will not be too terribly difficult for women as part of your congregation to engage the men and kind of work with them. But the sister, the daughter, or the wife, whoever she may be somewhat sensitive to men working with her. And so I would just be kind of cognizant of that and just maybe ask if she's okay. If like there's no other, obviously, if there's a woman that can work with her, I would recommend that. And then if there's not, and the only person that can help her do whatever is a male, then I would maybe ask for a brother to come along with. I would not have them one-on-one, right? Like just be sensitive to that. Just be sensitive to that. Again, you can kind of make an assessment when you go, but definitely have that on the forefront of your mind as you kind of go into that engagement.
Okay, I think Philip, thank you for that question and answer. Philip, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Salam alaikum, Baktash Ahadi. My name's Philip. I live in Lancaster, and Baktash and I know each other. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan in the early 70s. And just a couple of statements that I would like to make. One is the church that I belong to, Highland Presbyterian here in Lancaster, we are going to be having three Afghan families come to our community. And so as I listen to the participants, I'm on this committee to help with this situation. I would like to make the statement to the people in the audience or in the conversation here, not to be afraid to ask questions of Baktash, especially sometimes we think that, oh, this question's too stupid or too mundane to ask, and I want to hear your questions because I'm familiar with Afghanistan. I speak Dari from 50 years ago. It's kind of rusty, but I'm very, very familiar with what Baktash is saying. But it's more important for me so I can communicate to the members of our church what sometimes things that I take for granted, everybody should know. Many times people do not know. When I met with the chairperson of the committee that is heading up this effort, one thing I did say to him was the preconceived notions of what Afghans are, or who they are as people, I should say, who they are as people. And what I said to this man, I think shocked him, was that Baktash looks Afghan, I look Afghan. And many times it was not unusual for me to be approached by Afghans in the street when I was in Kabul or Herat, where I was located, to start speaking Dari to me because I looked Afghan. And we had this preconceived notion of what Afghan, and I told Tom, the chairperson, that I have blue or hazel colored eyes. My cook's eyes were bluer than mine. And the reason for that is that as Sikandar Khan, Alexander the Great, came down into the Indus Valley, the Greeks were traditionally blonde and blue-eyed. And so, so as his men married the local women, there are in many cases of Afghans having hazel or blue eyes. So what we have to try to do is to dismiss our preconceived notions of what an Afghan looks like and how they are. And so I'm asking the members of the group here to please ask questions so I can write them down and then say to the committee, this is what Americans think of Afghans or Afghanistan. And that's all I'm going to say, okay?
Thank you so much for that comment, Philip. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question right now? If not, I have one last question for Baktash that I know is very important. We don't have much time, about 5 minutes, Baktash, but you talked a lot about this issue of what it means to be American today, as illustrated by what happened in Afghanistan. And we are at an inflection point in trying to understand ourselves as a people. I thought that that might be an interesting reflection for you to offer us.
Yeah.
Because I know you've been thinking about it a lot.
I do. Yeah, I think this is great. I think this is important, especially for you who've served as an ambassador with the State Department. You, in some sense, lived that, right, before you did this.
Right.
And so what we have to kind of do is to say who we are. Like these last couple of years have been a very, very important time for America with the Trump presidency, with structural injustices as it pertains to race. All these things are kind of coming out with the quite literally the abandonment of Afghanistan, how we end that war. What we have to ask as Americans is say, who are we? How do we understand who we are? And then also, how do we want other people to understand who we are? How do we get the next generation? There are a lot of people here who are probably grandmothers and grandfathers. How do we get our young? How do we get the next generation to love America as much as we did, or we do, right? For those that have served in the Peace Corps on this line, Phil, Fran, Will, God bless you all. How do we instill a sense of national service to the next generation, such that people continue believing in this thing that we call America, right? This thing only works because we believe in it, right? We believe that our voice matters and that our vote matters. And so for me, the abandonment and the withdrawal from Afghanistan is a deep stain and a deep shame for America. But that doesn't mean that we are a bad country writ large, right? That decision was a bad decision. It was a terrible decision, in my opinion. And so I think it folds back into, and this idea of what it means to be aspirational in America, right? These are ideals that we stand for, that we are aspiring to, right?
Right.
So that doesn't mean we're arriving to these ideals. We're constantly pursuing them, and we're constantly editing to essentially get closer to what that actually is. And so for me, as an immigrant to this country who fits the profile of somebody who is dangerous to this country, when I get stopped at JFK or any airport, I don't take it personally. I see that as an opportunity to say, I'm going to go through what I have to go through. I'm going to endure what I can, and then enjoy I'm going to endure what I must, but enjoy what I can. And so we can either be really upset about who we are, or say, this is something that we should not acknowledge. Let's acknowledge it, and then let's work to become better. But I think we need to have a conversation about who we are. What does it mean to be an American? What are the values that we stand for? How do we understand who we are as a people right now? And how do we want to be perceived by the rest of the world? Right. So my offer to everyone here is to pursue these questions of what it means to be an American. What are the ideals that we stand for? And how do we essentially get on the same page to pursue those ideals collectively? Yeah.
Thank you, Baktash. I remember you mentioning that what sets America apart for you in your mind is the fact that we are aspirational and that we aspire to be better and we work towards it. And I do think that's a saving grace, and we need to build on that now. We've gone a tiny bit past time, but I definitely want to bring someone into the conversation that our congregation should know, and that's Mahmoud. Good morning, Mahmoud. Mahmoud Halali, if Sari could unmute him. Good morning. Mahmoud is the American citizen brother of our family, brother-in-law of our family, who came here 5 years ago and is now a citizen. And we're delighted you joined us today, Mahmoud.
Hey, thank you, Anne, for having me here. And thank you, Mr. Baktash Ahadi, for a great and inspiring story. It was really inspiring to me, and I will definitely share it with the family. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but just want to, on behalf of the family, just pass my gratitude and the families, how happy they are to be working with you. They've already built that connection. Like everyone knows, they flee the country in a very bad situation. They left their home, career, jobs, everything. So they're in like a really terrible situation, emotionally, physically, and everything. When they came here, they were so well and very nicely and warmly embraced by the community, especially the church. So everyone here and the church who's been involved, we are really thankful. They cannot believe it. Like they're still there, like we are dreaming here. How could people be so nice to us here? How could they give their furniture? How could they just give like a house to be there, three-room bedroom house and a nice place like a Massachusetts Avenue? So it's still there. They're very, they still have that trauma of leaving Afghanistan, their home. Their home is just robbed, unfortunately, by Taliban or there's someone else, but they still have that trauma. But on the other side, they're coming to a new house and a beautiful home, big family, big church family, Bethesda area community. They've been wonderful. So I'm here saying thank you on behalf of them, on behalf of myself and my wife. We are so relaxed now. It's a huge, not burden, but it's actually a great work that is just off of my and my wife's shoulders, so we can help our other family and ourselves. So thank you all. Thank you. We are grateful to you all.
Oh, Mahmoud, that's such a kind thing for you to say. And I also want to thank you, though, because you are an Army reservist and you are going off for 4 months to work at one of the bases and do translating for newly arrived Afghan refugees, correct?
Yeah, that's my privilege and honor to serve in the Army, to give back the least I can do. Like Mr. Ahadi said, we owe it so much to Americans and people. So by serving in the Army, it's a dream come true, and it's my honor and privilege.
Well, I'm looking for the day that we can get the two of you together.
Absolutely. It would be my honor to meet you all again. And of course, Mr. Ahadi, and learn from you.
Any last words, Mr. Ahadi, before we have to sign off here? We will thank you, but I want to give you a last word. Oh, unmute him, please. Please unmute Baktash. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Mahmoud. Thank you. I look forward to meeting you and your family one day, inshallah. Thank you so much. Yes. Oh gosh, parting words. If you take anything away from this conversation, I hope there are many things, but ultimately I would love for you to think about the importance of radical curiosity and being curious from a place of openness and being curious from a place of learning new things that you may not know about the world and how people understand their lived experience. And that's the space that I'm in my life. And what I've come to realize, another thing I'd love for people to realize is that we have people all around us that we've spent our lives with. And in some sense, we don't know who they actually are. So I'm in a place right now where I'm discovering my parents by asking them curious questions about their past. For example, who were my parents before I was born? What were their earliest memories? What were their relationships with their siblings? How did they fall in love with each other? And then what were the feelings they had when they first came to America, and how have they changed? And so I'm in a place now to be deeply curious about my own family, who I've spent my life with. And so if we can learn something about people that we spend our time with that shaped and formed us, what does it say that we can't learn from people that we've just met, especially from a country that we haven't ever been to, right? So the idea of radical curiosity, I think, is a powerful thing. And I think it's a superpower that we can all embrace and implement in our everyday lives.
And it's the way we're going to grow. We will grow from this interaction with our new family. And Mahmoud, we're just really delighted to be working with you and help you in your family, rather, and Gidi's family and the resettlement process. I want to say a special thank you to Will and Fran Irwin. I hope they're on today, because they were the ones who introduced me to Baktash and helped us secure this wonderful presentation. So thank you to them, and thanks to all our friends from UCC, our partners in this endeavor, who joined us today. I hope this will really be the beginning of a conversation that we can continue with Mahmoud, with the family, and with Baktash going forward. So thank you all, and go in peace.
Thank you, Anne. God bless. God bless everybody.
God bless. Thank you.